I'm Jim,
And I'm Garrett.
and this is
Jim
Jim
and
and Garrett
Garrett
at
at
the
the movies.
movies. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our podcast of Avengers Endgame. It's going to be all Avengers all the time. What we're going to do is something a little bit different. Instead of having a movie club entry this week, we will simply have a non-spoiler section of our review of Avengers Endgame, and then, of course, a spoiler section. This is the film that made $1.2 billion worldwide in three or 4 days. An absolutely amazing number, one of the biggest films and one of the most interesting films to discuss, because there's a lot here. This is a culmination of the MCU, at least this part of the MCU. So for those of you who don't know, Avengers Endgame was directed by Anthony and Joe Russo, the Russo brothers. It was produced by Kevin Feige. It stars Robert Downey Jr., Chris Evans, Mark Ruffalo, Chris Hemsworth, Scarlett Johansson, Jeremy Renner, Don Cheadle, Paul Rudd, Benedict Cumberbatch, Chadwick Boseman, Brie Larson, Tom Holland, Karen Gillan, Zoe Saldana, Evangeline Lilly, Tessa Thompson, Renee Russo, Elizabeth Olsen, Anthony Mackie, Sebastian Stan, Tom Hiddleston, Denai Guerrera, Benedict Wong, Dave Bautista, Letitia Wright, John Slattery, Tilda Swinton, John Favreau, Haley Atwell, Natalie Portman, Marissa Tomei, Taika Waititi, Angela Bassett, Michael Douglas, Michelle Pfeiffer, Colby Smulders, Linda Cardellini, and, of course, the great William Hurt. Oh, also Vin Diesel, Bradley Cooper, Gwyneth Paltrow, Robert Redford, Chris Pratt, Samuel L. Jackson, Ross Marquand, and the director himself, or one of them, Joe Russo. Additionally starring Yvette Nicole Brown, Ken Jeong, and John Slattery. Okay, and that's really it. So, Garrett, what did you think of Avengers Endgame?
There was a lot of people in Avengers Endgame. My God, so many people.
Oh yeah, it's a lot of movie. I think last year on this channel I gave Avengers Infinity War the award for most movie. Avengers Endgame is also most movie. So this section right here, we'll talk non-spoiler thoughts, and then we'll give you a real signpost of when our spoiler thoughts are. So just non-spoilers, real quick. Kind of, what did you think of? How did this work for you?
I was just frankly astounded. I mean, if you were to tell me out of context, 10, 11 years ago, whatever, prior to the development of MCU or cinematic universes in the modern contemporary sense, that they would be able to pull together a cast list this large with so many different plots and so many different character arcs that they needed to tie up, centered around what is essentially sort of an action adventure story that would be cinematically impressive, astounding visual effects. I would tell you it couldn't be done. I would tell you that that the ambition was too high, that it was Icarus flying too close to the sun, and it would crash and burn, and it would be terrible. It would be a laughing stock. It would cost way too much money and many people's careers. If I'm the producer sitting in the room, I say wave off, Ghost Rider. And god damn would I have been wrong, because it works. I mean, it's just the astounding thing is that on every level, the incredible number of balls in the air, the Russo brothers have just managed to somehow stick the landing, if I can mix my metaphors there. It's just so impressive how everything ties up, how it's paced wonderfully. Everyone gets a fair amount of screen time for their character. It sets up new material for going into phase 4 of the MCU. It closes off the relevant plot threads that were before. It echoes back to so many of the previous MCU films. I've seen the film, and I still can't believe they managed to pull it off. I was so impressed.
Yes, I agree. I mean, this is the degree of difficulty involved here, and what it has done in sticking the landing is just mind-boggling. Now, essentially what Kevin Feige, the producer and sort of mastermind of the MCU, has done is taken the television model, the serialized television model, combined it with the serialized comic book model and put it into motion pictures, which hasn't been done before. And so it's not as, but I guess my point is, it's not as though this is purely out of the realm of possibility. This is the type of thing that other mediums are doing and have done. It's just that Avengers is the one that made it work. The MCU is the one that made it work, whereas the DCEU has faltered. And of course, there was the aborted Universal Monsters franchise that didn't that sort of failed at imitating and aping what Avengers Endgame does. I mean, my non-spoiler thoughts are that this movie is it's introspective when it needs to be. It allows its characters um, to breathe and to be human, to be, you know, interesting and dimensional. Its focus is really interesting. There's a character that gets a lot of focus in this film. Obviously, I won't give that away in this section of the review, but I thought that that was the perfect character to move this story along, and I thought it worked really, really well. This is, I mean, we're sort of taking a step back and marveling at what they've done, but in the actual marveling, in the actual meat of the film, it's a well constructed movie, and it has its moments of character, and then when it has the chance to go balls to the wall, all of the balls go at the wall. Like, it's amazing how this film is able to stick the landing. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really the operative word for this, is this film sticks the landing.
So now, after we saw Infinity War, you and I both sort of, brainstormed and pitched our own ideas. Not so much like theories as to about what was going to happen, but so much just sort of like a little exercise of, if we were writing the screenplay for the next installment, how would we do it? Now, I don't want to go into the details of that. That would probably would bore people a little bit. But I am curious. One of the things that I often use when I'm sort of gauging a film is, could I have sort of written that better? Do my ideas for this premise, are they better executed? Would I like, did I like the story I told in my head better than the story I saw on the screen? So I'm curious, on that metric, using your own ideas about how you would have done it, do you think this film surpassed your own imaginations, or met them, or fell below them?
I'd like to. Can I talk about that during the spoiler section? Because actually, I one of the things that I was thinking of as I was watching this movie was how similar some of the themes of this film were to the incredibly long pseudo script that I wrote. So yeah, I, I, I'm going to reverse that question on you, and then I'll answer that question in the spoiler section.
Fair enough. For me, yeah, I mean, I was reflecting on it in that way. And while I will admit, like everyone who has their own sort of pet ideas, I kind of liked the sort of mechanic, as it were, or sort of the central tool that was used sort of to resolve the main conflict. I did feel that one of the weaknesses of the film was the mechanic that they used to to not fix everything per se, because not everything's fixed, but to revive the combat with Thanos was something that was not cheap per se, but a little obvious once they pointed to it. I thought mine was a little bit more clever, but at the same time, I don't think had they gone with mine, that they could have been able to pull off everything else that they pulled off so well. It would have required too much investments to play out that thread, that it would have squeezed out a lot of the other quality, like some of the deeper emotions that they played with, and the character arcs, and again, the incredible pacing and balancing and so forth. So yeah, I would say on that metric, I think this film surpassed what I imagined in my own head. So
Yeah. What? Yeah. Let's sort of close up shop here in the non-spoiler section. I think we both recommend the movie. I am at 4 stars initially, although in the subsequent days I have sort of fallen to 3.5. And I'll describe why in the spoiler section. But let's just say that my final thoughts on this film is that it is character driven in all of the right ways, and when it needs to be an Avengers movie, it's an Avengers movie, and the geek-tastic, um, the geek-tastic elements of this film will keep you excited for a few days, and then it'll kind of wear off. But that's my final thoughts. What do you think, Aaron?
Are we on a 4-star scale or a 5-star scale?
Five. For
Five?
yeah, I'm 4 out of 5.
Okay, so they're not 3.5 out of 5.
Well, my initial rating was 4 out of 5. I have then fallen to 3.5 out of 5.
Okay, because I'm at a 4.5 out of 5. But
Four and a half out of 5.
there's
Okay.
some fairly nitpicky criticisms which we'll get into in the spoilery section, but this is a movie that I know I'm gonna see again in the theaters. I may see a third time in the theaters, which is something I almost never do, and then I'm gonna watch it again when it's out on streaming and home. This is a film that is incredibly rewatchable. It's 3 hours long. There's not many 3-hour films that have that kind of compulsive returnability to them. It's pretty much just it's yeah no this is possibly the best or maybe the second best comic book movie ever in my opinion. It's
What's
one.
number one?
Dark Knight.
Dark Knight. Me too.
Yeah.
I put it below Black Panther in the MCU. And I put it below Guardians and Infinity War in the MCU.
Yeah, it surpasses all those. All phenomenal films, definitely. But I think Endgame is better than the lot for me.
Fair enough. Okay, so this is your spoiler warning.
Spoiler warning! Spoiler warning! Spoiler warning!
Spoiler warning. From now on, we won't be talking spoilers. You can pause the video, and then you can go see the movie because we both recommend it, and then you can come back and watch the rest. Okay, I think we've given enough time for people to get up from their couches and run over to wherever the sound is playing and pause it. Okay. So spoilery. Look, the event as soon as Sam said, "Cap, can you hear me?" On your left, I'm getting chills right now. I got absolute chills. I was like, all right, let's do this. I'm ready. Let's go, motherfucker. It's that third act climax. It's fucking amazing. And how they are able to get all of those characters, and that final battle is just, and then a game of rugby breaks out in the middle of a game of rugby breaks out in the middle of the battle. I thought it was just phenomenal. That's spectacular filmmaking. That's spectacle. What were some of the things that you want to talk about in the spoiler section?
Well, why don't we start with that? I mean, again, a quick contrast between how Endgame pulled off sort of the final battle with Return of the King. Now, Return of the King again had spectacle. Again, it was visually astounding. No one can fault the technical side of things. But by the time I got to that final huge battle in Return of the King, I was so fucking tired of massive combat in Lord of the Rings universe. I felt, it just felt rote. It felt like I'd seen everything. It felt tired. Endgame, I think, did the fantastic job and the disciplined job of having just of holding off on almost all of the action, almost all of the combat. Again, there's a few fight scenes here and there, of course, some things to sort of to liven it up, but there was no sort of no spectacle, no grand scale combat up until that final moment. And I think that was absolutely, again, they make you wait for it, they make you hold your breath, and then they deliver that. I mean, again, not just technically, of course, a masterful final fight sequence, but again, emotionally and narratively solid conclusion. It worked fantastic. It was great.
I had chest pains during that thing. I was really geeked. I can't imagine what, like, if I wore one of those Fitbits, I can't imagine what my heart rate was during that. And then when Cap said Avengers assemble, fuck. We've waited 22 movies for you to say that, my friend, and you finally did. It was oh boy. Again, that's the type of thing that I want to go back and see again,
Yeah.
and maybe be able to have maybe less of a visceral reaction to it and more of an intellectual reaction to it. But I suspect that it's going to be just as captivating on the second viewing than it is on the first, as it is on the first. It
Yeah.
was just,
For me, one of the big double take moments, I mean, where I mean, it seriously, I saw it and it took me a while to fully process it, was 5 years later. And I was like, wow, I was not seeing that coming. You know,
I
I was
think
not
that's great.
expecting that.
I think the anticlimactic kill of Thanos worked really well. I think that anticlimactic kit where they kill Thanos within the first 15 minutes of the film, I thought that was like I was like, all right, what this film has now surprised me. Where's it going to go next? Because we've got 3 hours of movie left. What are you doing? And the fact that this film spends the first hour or so actually dealing with a world in which half of life is gone. That's where I'm talking about this film being a character driven piece where we're actually getting to see these characters reacting to their failure. Now there's a lot of backlash to dad bod Thor or whatever, but I think I think that worked with his character. That's an expression of his pain. I don't see that as humorous as some people saw it, and as it was even played in the film. I found that to be a truly compelling element of what that character would go through after failing so spectacularly.
So I mean, you call it dad bod Thor, you know. I I will admit that my theater thought it was, you know, seemed to think it was pretty funny. That people were laughing, and I was laughing along too. But yeah, in retrospect, I got to say, it did feel, I would call it fat phobic Thor. You know, it's using his body as a punchline, and for people who've had to live their whole lives with their bodies being other people's punchlines, I can really understand how that would hurt, and that's kind of fucked up. So, yeah, in retrospect, again, I didn't catch it first, but now after listening to other people's complaints, I got to say that was something that now I don't like about the movie.
Yeah, I mean I found it to be an element of his character that an element of character progression, a element of character change.
There's
Um,
lots of ways they could have done that, that didn't play him being fat for laughs. That's uh,
Perhaps,
yeah.
perhaps. I mean, that's not. Yeah, it didn't. I didn't read it the same way most other people seem to have read it. I read it as an expression of character, of how his body um, expressed his shame at failure.
Yeah.
And
Again,
I understand the other sort of the point that you're articulating. So, what? Uh, Let me get to some other things that I liked about the. Well, why don't you give me some other things you liked about this film, spoilerly, and then I'll.
I thought that they dealt with grief in an incredibly
Yes.
powerful way. I mean, you know, as you know, again, as a professional philosopher, one of my areas of interest is death and the way people think about death and cope with death and the way different cultures manage death. And it's, you know, it's sort of a side hobby for me. And I felt that they had all these different characters dealing and processing in different ways with the combination not only of having to have lost their friends and their allies and of course half the population of the universe, but also the fact that it was their failure and their inability to stop it, that sort of compounded everything. I mean, the speech that Iron Man gives when he's first sort of reunited to Cap, and he says, and he's basically, "I fucking told you, you know, or you ring of armor, suit of armor around the world, you know," and calling back to that debate. That they had, that fight was, anyway, it was a fantastic piece of throwback to the earlier films, which is something else we can talk about in a moment, all the throwbacks. But I mean, Robert Downey Jr. delivered it with such pathos, and it was
Yeah.
completely fucking believable. It was powerfully done.
Yeah, I agree. And Cap running the survivors group. I thought that was really good. Especially we've got our first openly LGBT character in the film, played by one of the directors. In that survivor group's scene, I thought, yeah, this first hour is the part of the movie that I was most compelled by. I thought that the first hour was just masterfully done. It was almost as though I was watching a comic book movie, but elevated into uh, in a deep character-driven drama.
Right.
And that this is what I'm talking about when I say that the MCU works when it understands these heroes as people, not as these mythic
Right.
figures.
And the way, Black Widow, Natasha, was sort
Yes.
of taking the sort of the mantle of everything on her shoulders, because all the rest of the Avengers basically lost their shit. Tony ran off to the wilderness. Captain America had to focus on the small stuff. Banner had to become Banner Hulk. Hawkeye had to go off to become Ronin. Everyone else had to deal with their own stuff, and Natasha's the one who steps the fuck up, and it
Mhm.
is crushing her, and she just knuckles down because she has to knuckle the fuck down. And that was like, yes, that's absolutely fucking right. I need the character driven movement there that was just perfect.
And it fulfills a character arc that she has gone through over the course of the entire films. I mean, she starts as this Russian agent, which of course we don't get to see, but then in her introduction in Iron Man 2 and then in Cap 2, she's got this loyalty to this organization, and slowly that loyalty becomes a loyalty to the other Avengers, to the people around her. And she's trying to hold, in this case, in this film, she is trying to hold both of those loyalties in her mind at the same time. I think you're right when you talk about how this pressure is crushing her, and yet she is able to handle it so well. I love so much about this. The first hour of this movie.
And Nebula, can we talk about Nebula really
Yes.
quickly? I mean, she is a character who you literally get to see her character arc, because there's two versions of her: the early version that we first meet her, and then the version she's become fighting against one another. It's like, that is such a clever device to see how a character is transformed. And even though she's still, definitely this sort of sociopathic, hardcore cyborg killer, she somehow has become a member of the Guardians of the Galaxy, and it changes her profoundly.
Yeah.
Like, that's that you really get to see that, and that's just an incredibly effective way of demonstrating that.
That was one of the things I was talking about in the non-spoiler section, where I was like, how this film finds a character that that got a lot of play in Guardians 2, some play in Guardians 1, and she becomes one of the linchpins of this film, and it's perfectly logical for her to serve that plot function. And I thought that that's only a decision that you make if you know this universe so well, and you know these characters as well as the Russo brothers and Kevin Feige and the writing team behind these films.
Yeah, Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely. Yeah.
Yes, they're the credited writers, but I mean they've got a whole room of people working on this shit.
Certainly.
And so the whole team made a really good decision by making Nebula one of the centerpieces of this film, I think. It's wow. What else do we want to say good about this film? Do you want to talk about some of the callbacks that you liked?
Yeah. I mean, I already mentioned the suit of armor around the world. That was great. The going back to the first Avengers movie and having the cap on cap fight and the jokes about America's ass and stuff like that, I thought were both funny and well done. And it's this sort of thing where, you know if the world wasn't so intricately set up in such a way where Captain could believe, Captain in the past could believe he was looking at Loki, so it would make sense, so he wouldn't be freaking the shit out. Where in another movie, Captain America looking at Captain America be like, "What the hell's going on?" But because we have the character of Loki and his mechanics in place, Old Cap's reaction to new Cap makes perfect sense, and it's just like,
Sure.
that's just seamless fucking gear transitioning there.
And you've got that great moment in the elevator where he's in the elevator not having a fight, and he does the callback to the comics, Hail Hydra.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So now this brings me to what I think was one of the things that I thought you would have loved about this movie, although you haven't said it yet. But it's a complaint I've heard you make about so many movies, in particular comic book movies, is that in many instances in this movie, the solution isn't violence. The
Yes.
solution is thinking it through and coming up with a solution that pure violence couldn't get you. And that the scene in the elevator is probably the most straightforward example of that.
Yep.
But there's many other examples as well. There's that little joke in there when they first show up back during the climax of the first Avengers, where Banner Hulk is just sort of like, smash or whatever. It all feels kind of lame at this point. It's a film that's, again, wouldn't necessarily call it cerebral, but the characters can't just kill their way out of the problem. They have to think their way out of the problem and think their way out of another problem after thinking through that problem, and the thinking problems just stack up over and over again, to the point where the only major real sort of instance of violence is there at the very climax.
Right. Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. That was an element that I was going to talk about with this film, is that this is not reliant upon violence being the normative solution to all of their problems, which is, and in fact, when they behead Thanos in the first 15 minutes of the movie, it almost, like, that doesn't solve the problem at all. And I love the fact that it's an anticlimactic death for this big bad that was built up in Infinity War. I thought that was a brilliant choice. That we get this fight with Thanos, they chop his head off, and in fact, it kind of makes things worse because there's no longer an external locus of all of their frustration. Now the locus of their frustration is each other and the world that they have to live in, now that they can't undo the thing that was done. That's a fantastic first 15 minutes and first hour of the film. Yeah, I think we've said a lot of good things about this movie, rightly so, because it is a good film. It is a film that I recommend. Oh yeah, one other thing that I wanted to talk about. You brought up my my fake writing of the of Infinity War. So you pitched a Infinity War 2, and then I decided to write an entire. I'm looking at the DM right now, and it's multiple screens long. I decided to write an entire movie, and one of the things that,
I wrote a pitch, you wrote a treatment.
Yeah, right. You wrote an elevator pitch. I wrote a treatment. That's, yeah, fair. And I got a lot of it kind of along the same lines as what they did, about how Ant-Man becomes the vessel of time travel. And one of the other things I did was talk about, the theme of the treatment that I wrote is that the ordinary life can be just as seductive as the extraordinary life. I have Cap and Tony living in suburbia playing beer league softball together. And in that, like, it's this fantasy that's created by the reality stone in my fake movie. And while they didn't do a fantasy created by the reality stone in this film, they did. I really like Tony's journey, where he becomes a father. That means something to him. He is no longer a superhero. That is, I love how this film sort of captures that thematic essence of the ordinary life can be just as satisfying as the extraordinary life. I think that's a brilliant theme for the real Avengers Endgame to address.
If you
And of
do
course,
say
we
so
see that.
yourself, right?
What's that?
If you do say so yourself, because it's the
If
theme
I
of the
do say
show.
so myself, since I also did the same fucking thing. But yeah, I really like that. And it's expressed in Captain America's final journey as well, which has its problems, which I will talk about soon. Um, where Cap grows old and lives with Peggy. That's I think that's a touching end to that character.
Yeah, I mean, again, the film opens up. The first shot is with Barton, Clint Barton, with his family, being domestic, and the closing shot is Steve Rogers with his wife together. It's the bookends are very clearly deliberate in that regard.
Right. And it's very similar to the film that I thought of myself that I thought would work as well. So that was as I was watching the movie, I was like, oh, they're doing some of the things I did. That's cool. Um, so Lenny, do you have any criticisms of the movie before I give mine?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think they're by and large all pretty small. Not certainly nothing major. I mean, so I'll start with just one. I was kind of disappointed with how they handled Captain Marvel. I
Mm,
mean, she shows up in the beginning and obviously is important for the beginning, and then she just disappears for pretty much the whole movie. Now, again, I understand that the film is more about the established Avengers, and so it makes sense that she would be on the back burner. And given that they wanted her off the screen, they had a reasonable explanation for why she wasn't. She had lots of all the other planets that she had to deal with, and that makes sense. And maybe in one of the sequels, we'll see what she's doing in that time. But at the same time, it kind of felt like they really sort of built her up, and it would have been nice to see how she interact. I mean, we only see her doing the fighting. Again, all that stuff we're talking about the sort of the character and the grieving and all that plot mechanics. We don't really see any of that from her. We
mm.
just see her, go take the fight to Thanos and then come back for the final battle. It would have been nice if we had some character motion going in there for her.
It's a 3 hour movie. They're shoving that shit in
Right,
too. Where
exactly. You can totally understand why. I mean, with that many balls in the air, some of them are gonna be tossed off to the side a little bit. But again, like I say, if we're nitpicking, we're nitpicking. So
yeah, I think my nitpicks are a little more elemental to the film. I think that this film hand waves a lot of the time travel stuff.
yeah, so let's.
And
Well, again, I alluded to this in our spoiler-free part, so let's come back to it. Yeah, I was disappointed just with time travel as a mechanic. In part because while they had established that time works different in the quantum realm, they didn't really do anything in the previous movies to suggest you could travel backwards in time. And I kind of felt I wish that the previous Ant-Man films had said something about backwards time travel. Now, granted, it would be hard to do that without spoiling, without tipping your hand. But I felt as though they kind of cheated in that regard.
well, even within the rules that this film sets up for time travel, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because they have, first of all, they establish in Guardians and some of the other films that you can't touch an Infinity Stone, and these people are like flipping around like bottle caps. There's yeah, people are holding some Infinity Stones.
When
Um, Hulk is, Cap is at the end. Like there's a lot of
at the end, the stones are all on the gauntlet.
then he puts them in the the briefcase that he uses to travel back in time. But anyway, Clint, Hawkeye's holding one, Hawkeye's holding the whole Infinity Gauntlet, and on and on and on.
Well, you can
So
hold the gauntlet. The whole point of the gauntlet is it can keep the stones abreast. But yeah, if they are holding them, if humans are holding them in their bare hands, that I agree, that's definitely a problem. I mean, Thanos can hold them in his bare hands, Hulk can hold them in his bare hands, but yeah, humans should not be able to hold a straight Infinity Stone.
yeah,
Um,
this is one of the reasons I want to go back to the film with a clearer head, because I was kind of geeked by this movie, and then it took away. I sort of registered some things in the back of my head without actually being able to notice them while I was watching the film. But even let's go through the rules that are suggested about time travel in this film. That if you go back in time, you take an Infinity Stone, then an alternate world, an alternate timeline is created. So Hulk makes the deal with the Ancient One that, don't worry, I'm going to come back to this very same spot in time and give you this stone back so that the timeline progresses the same way it would have.
Mm-hmm.
But so that means, and when I'm talking about the time travel stuff is hand waved away, it's just Cap entering the time machine, and then we don't actually get to see the return of the Infinity Stones. But we have to assume that he goes back to Vormir and like hangs out with Red Skull and is like, here, you'll need this in a few years when Thanos comes. That seems strange. He has to
That's not breaking the
etherize.
rules. I mean, I agree. It's left to the imagination what happens, but there's no rule breaking there.
Well, he has to etherize the Infinity Stone and then stick it in Natalie Portman again.
I think he can probably give it to the people in Valhalla, and they'll figure it out.
Okay. I mean, this is the type of thing that's kind of hand waved away in this film, right?
Right, but again, 3-hour movie. You're not. I mean, maybe they'll follow up on some of the stuff in the subsequent films or TV shows. But I that doesn't bother me at all because yeah, you're right. It's left to the imagination, but there's no rule breaking there.
But
I do have a concern about rule breaking though that they may have. Maybe they solved it. Maybe they didn't. I just missed it. But maybe I'll let you finish your concerns first before I bring that up.
well, Cap hanging out with Peggy for the rest of his life, that breaks the continuity.
Right.
Um,
But that so what?
so what?
Yeah,
Then
the consequence of that is that Cap and Peggy get to live together. So we have two separate timelines now. One where Peggy is alone, and one where Peggy is with Cap.
yeah, but two separate timelines is exactly what the Ancient One didn't want to create.
Yeah, well, the Ancient One didn't get a choice in that one, now did she?
Okay, but that's hand waving some of this stuff away. Like, how does I mean, if we talk about like chaos theory and how a simple in addition of Captain America to the 1940s, living with Peggy
No,
Carter, and then
it's
of course
not
she
Captain
has a
America.
daughter that
It's
ends up
Steve Rogers.
kissing Captain America in Civil War.
It's Steve Rogers, not Captain America. He very
Or
clearly
Steve Rogers.
hangs up the shield. Now, again,
So
one thing
Is Steve Rogers living his entire life where Bucky is being tortured, and then when he tells other Cap that Bucky is alive, doesn't that change the timeline?
It's a
And when
it's a different timeline. It's not that's not the same one. Again, maybe he goes and saves Bucky. I don't know. I think it was Bob Chipman commented like, does he just let the Holocaust happen? I guess because all the other sorts of shit. But that's again, I think maybe a larger issue. But I mean, like you say, the seductive power of the normal. If he is going to give up being Captain America and be just Steve Rogers with with his wife, then yeah, no, I think that's the price he has to pay. He's going to lay that down. Now, and again, you call it hand waving. I don't see that as hand waving. Again, I do see it as unanswered questions, unanswered threads. Again, which maybe they will go revisit, and sometime maybe they won't. But worst case scenario, it's left up to the viewer's imagination, and I kind of like stories that leave things up to the imagination to a certain degree.
and does he bring Mjolnir back to Asgard as well?
That was my concern. Yeah, that was the one that I was concerned about because I didn't see him bring Mjolnir back to Asgard, and that's not that's not an omission because if Thor does not have Mjolnir, then the events of Ragnarok don't play out the same way, and they play out in a radically different way. In fact, so it seems like that's a separate timeline where it's not just what would have happened, but rather what we understand as the main thread of time to be in the MCU would be radically altered by that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm talking about when I say this is hand wavy, is that I wish that I understand that it's a 3-hour movie. I understand that there's not I I wish that these holes weren't so obvious after I got over the high of watching the movie. Now, as I watched the film, I was 4 stars on the film. I loved it. I had a great time. But then it took about 2 days for that high to wear off, and I was like, wait a second, some of this doesn't make sense. There was some shit in the back of my head as I was watching it, but now I'm wondering, like, and Loki is running around with the Tesseract.
Yeah, no, but we're gonna see. We're gonna get more of that. There's gonna be
Mhm.
a Loki series apparently, and that's, to my mind, that's exactly where that's gonna tee off from.
Yeah, but then everything can't work out just the way it did if Loki has the Tesseract at the end of in the first Avengers movie.
Right, and so that's going to be a different timeline, and maybe that's in that alternate timeline things happen. I mean, again, I'm just brainstorming here, but maybe one of these alternate timelines will Black Widow will be saved, and that's where her solo movie is going to come from one of these alternate timelines. You can do it in
Yeah,
Star
now
Trek,
it's
you can do it in MCU.
for a franchise that has stayed relatively straightforward. This is introducing a level of complexity and a level of um, craziness that makes it rival the X-Men timeline.
Yeah.
Which I think they should just catapult the entire thing, wait 10 years, and then start making X-Men movies as soon as Dark Phoenix comes and rehashes X3.
I want an Avengers versus X-Men movie. The Avengers versus X-Men comics were always fun.
Yeah, you'll get it, I promise.
Yeah.
Okay, so those were some of my concerns about the film.
Yeah.
You're explaining them by saying alternate timelines, and for a franchise that has not jumped into that alternate timeline bullshit,
Right.
we're now knee deep in it.
Yeah, and again, that's not to dismiss the general category of concern you have here, and this is part of the reason why I was a little disappointed in the time travel, because it's a tired mechanic. You've seen it done many times. It's done really well, granted. I mean, in most respects, but I would have liked to have seen them do something a little bit more fresh. A little bit more novel, since they have. I mean, but something occurred to me. The second Thanos said that they were atomized, I was like, aha, we have a superhero that can get as small as an atom. That's the thread. And obviously I was wrong. And maybe that particular idea wouldn't have worked. But that was a thought that occurred to me. So something different, rather than time travel, something that could be done in the MCU, but couldn't be done, or it couldn't be done elegantly in 100 other movies. Probably would have been preferable to me. But again, when you consider the sort of the incredible machine that's all geared together, who knows? You change that, the whole thing might fall apart. So it's precisely because it is so complicated and intricate.
You just reminded me of another thing. They took Thanos out of the timeline. Like,
oh yeah,
Thanos, yes,
yeah, they did.
Thanos goes from, he's no longer in the timeline.
Yeah, that's kind of a complication, isn't it?
How the fuck is he gonna snap anything if he's dead 5 years, like 10 years before he even gets the stones?
Yeah, that's a paradox right there.
Or 3. That's off. Yeah, that's I. How is that not my first? They're hand waving a whole bunch of shit, but they took Thanos out of the timeline.
Yeah, that's that one's a complication, definitely.
Okay, all right. So now you know why I went from 4 stars to 3.5 on this film. Anyway, all right. It's probably time to close up shop. We've been talking about it's a 3-hour movie, and we might do a 3-hour podcast. We probably could on this film because it's so big and epic and awesome, and I liked it. But once I recovered from my Avengers hangover, I was like, wait a second, did we make some bad decisions that night?
So a quick throwback. What this is reminding me of is the first time, and then probably the second time I saw Minority Report. When I sat back and started thinking through the different sort of timeline possibilities and issues that were going on in Minority Report, I came up with a lot of similar criticisms of things where, if you don't think about them, the film works just fine. But once you stop to think about it, it's like, yeah, there's no way that can work.
Right.
It's a non-starter.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about 2 weeks from now. We're doing so we're gonna take next week off again. We've taken 2 weeks off for my grading. Now we're taking 1 week off for Garrett's grading and his day job. In 2 weeks we will return with a review of Detective Pikachu, and we'll be pairing that go back to our regular format of review movie club news with Zootopia. So we'll be reviewing Detective Pikachu and talking about Zootopia. I
Can
hope
I just say how much I want Thor to be part of the Guardians of the Galaxy? I mean, I
Oh,
really
that's gonna
hope
be
they
so
don't
much
rush that
fun.
off. Like, I want him to be a permanent full member. That would be so fucking cool.
That's gonna be great. Yeah, they just gave James Gunn Thor to work with. Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Right. Okay, we gotta stop talking about fucking Avengers shit. Detective Pikachu, Zootopia, 2 weeks. Until then, I'm Jim,
And I'm Garrett.
and this has been
Jim
Jim
and
and Garrett
Garrett
at
at the
Movies.
movies.
Good night.